Hey everyone, this is Nick from Anticonquista. I'm here with Evan King from Witness for Peace. We're here to just talk about Colombia, give some more updates on what's going on, talk about the situation throughout the nation, particularly in Cali and Afro-Colombian communities. Um, Evan right now is in Colombia. How you doing today, Evan?
I'm good.
Good. That's good to hear. Yeah, the situation is getting pretty tense down there. It's been, escalating over time. It's getting more and more intense. And so it's important that, we make sure that we keep all eyes focused on what's going on, and we make sure that we keep, staying updated and staying conscious and educated, informing the diaspora, but also informing people in Latin America and all throughout the world, and making connections. I think international connections between the imperialism and the aggression that we see in Colombia and what we've seen recently in Palestine, what we've seen, 2 months ago in Haiti, what's going on right now in Puerto Rico. Um, these are all international connections that we can talk about. And not only that, but also what's happening here in the US, especially when we talk about Afro-Colombians and the Black communities in Latin America and the Black communities here in the US that oftentimes face, this sort of violent police repression and police brutality. Um, so Evan, if you want to, start us off, just talking about, who you are, what you do in Colombia, some of the stuff that you've done for solidarity, international solidarity, just a brief background.
Sure. Yeah. My name's Evan King. I'm a part of the Witness for Peace Solidarity Collective. It's a U.S.-based organization that has presence in different countries across Latin America. My job here in Colombia is to provide physical and political accompaniment for grassroots organizations that are facing extreme forms of violence and political repression by the U.S. And its corporations. So our job is to accompany these grassroots groups that are struggling on the front lines and document these violations and try and get folks in the United States to pressure our own government to hold it to account for all the things that it's responsible for in Latin America, particularly in Colombia.
Right, and it's important too to make those connections between what's going on, how the U.S. is complicit, the U.S. government is complicit in the funding, in the arming, and the training of the state forces in Colombia, whether it be the national police, the military, the officers, and also providing them with weapons. So that's it's important that we do that work, and it's important that we raise the consciousness and really start off by educating people of what's going on and how their nation is complicit in building those links. So just to get right into it, we could talk about right now, I guess the general. Last week we did an update. I did an updated video on some of the situations in Colombia. So we talked about specifically the threat Duque made in terms of threatening to essentially declare martial law, total military mobilization. I forget the specific name of the decree. It's escaping my mind right now, but it's essentially martial law, like total mobilization of the entire military. He sent, what was it, 7,000 to 9,000 troops into Cali, which has been basically the epicenter, one of the epicenters of the resistance. We're seeing people dying it's horrible to talk about the level of atrocities, the amount of people dying every day. Within a matter of days, we saw dozens of people killed in Cali alone, just by, in a matter of days of sending troops there. So I guess since last week, what have been some of the major updates that we've seen in Colombia on the ground, whether it be what certain, political officials have said and what the people who have been resisting have been doing?
Yeah, Cali is as you said, the epicenter of the current struggle, and it's because of its strategic location and the strategic significance that it has in terms of the role it plays in the Colombian economy. It's perhaps the most important city in the Southwest, probably one of the most important cities in Colombia in general, and it's kind of the window into the main port, the most important port in the country, which is Buenaventura. So the only way to get to Buenaventura and take your merchandise, all the commerce, most of the exchange, most of the exports and imports come through that port. Up to 80% of them go through Buenaventura and then get to Cali, and from Cali are distributed throughout the country. So controlling Cali, affects all the big, capitalist interests in Colombia, especially the sugarcane interest, which is one of the most powerful kind of industries in the country, and that's why they face such violence, along with the racial composition of the city. Cali is the second blackest city in Latin America, I think second to Salvador Bahia. So the composition of Afro-descendant and indigenous people is significant in the city, and they make up something like 60% of the city. And in certain parts of the city, they're closer to 80%, especially in the parts that are facing the most repression. So it's important to keep those things in mind to try and understand why is it that Cali is facing this kind of militarization. It's a combination of those two things, of the economic factors, but also the racialized violence that we see that is just very, very much in the tradition of colonialism that is continuing, in different forms. And so I was just in Cali on a mission, an international solidarity and human rights mission, along with some compañeros from Argentina that were there to document some of the violations that have been going on and try and systematize those to try and prosecute in a court of law, an extraterritorial court of law, because the Colombian courts just don't function. So we're trying to get those to international bodies that could, at the very least, start to prosecute those responsible for the crimes against humanity that we're seeing. We're seeing things like forced disappearances, massacres, the use of sexual violence as a weapon, as a weapon of war. Since we were there, the night that we were there in Siloé, there was, or in the city of Cali in general, there was something like 11 to 12 people killed in one night, on the night of the 28th, which marked the 1 month of struggle. And it was precisely that day that became perhaps the deadliest day so far in the violence. Since the decree that you mentioned, Duque, basically forcing, it's kind of cool in the sense that it takes away the autonomy of individual mayors to make decisions around public safety in their own cities. So it forces them to collaborate with the military, or otherwise they'll face penalties, and they can even be prosecuted for like treason and whatnot. And so it basically ties their hands to try and de-escalate the violence, which was what was happening while we were there between the mayor of Cali and the different points of resistance in the city. So there's a combined body, the URC, which is the United Resistance of Cali, which is a combination of the 18 points of resistance in Cali, and they've kind of formed this unified front to be able to negotiate certain terms with the government, and they were de-escalating at the same time that Duque militarized the city and completely sabotaged the process of trying to de-escalate the situation and trying to, have these young people and these, marginalized, excluded communities heard, and was completely blindsided by this hyper militarization of the city. As you said, close to 7,000 troops deployed in Cali. And subsequently, we're seeing just last night another shooting by the military and police that killed two people on the front lines, and injured like 14 other people in Paso del Comercio, or what has been renamed El Paso del Aguante, which is kind of the commercial district of the city of Cali. So those have been the developments. We see really the government here seems to have no interest in negotiating. The negotiations with the Comité del Paro, the strike committee, the National Strike Committee, has basically fallen apart. Now they're calling for the Comité de Paro is calling for a popular assembly to try and organize the ongoing mobilizations that have kind of a little bit started to decentralize in a way that's hard to control, to the hindrance, I think, of the movement. But, when you prolong these kinds of mobilizations for this long, it's just really hard to contain, especially when you face this kind of violence. Each community is just kind of trying to defend itself in whatever ways it can, which usually is with like makeshift shields and rocks and whatever, facing this, hyper militarized, fully equipped and funded military, is backed by the United States. Yeah, it's a totally asymmetrical situation.
Right. So yeah, I mean that was a lot of good information in terms of updates and what's going on. I want to first touch on some of the first things you talked about, the importance of Cali strategically, economically, because I think this isn't really touched on or talked about too much. But I think it's important to couch it in economic terms. Why do they care so much about Cali? Well, part of it is because of the resistance has been so strong, but also, like you mentioned, the economics of it. It's a major transportation hub, right? So let's start off with, what is the goal of the government in terms of trying to secure this transportation hub? Is it because one of the things we've seen develop too is they use the military to blockade these cities, right? To stop the going the in and out of supplies to actually help those who are resisting. So what is the goal of like maintaining Cali? What happens to Duque and his government if they lose Cali? If they can't establish control? What happens if they do establish control to Cali? What happens to the resistance?
Yeah, I mean, Cali is such a strategic place, and not just Cali, like Valle del Cauca as a department. Just outside Cali, you see places like Jumbo, Jamundí, Palmira. I mean, these are municipalities, small cities that are industrial hubs of the country. I mean, in Jumbo, we also see very fierce repression. It's like not as visible as in Cali, but Jumbo is the industrial capital of Valle del Cauca and perhaps of the southwest part of the country, where the fiercest repression is located is precisely in Ecopetrol. There's a refinery in Jumbo of Ecopetrol, which is Colombia's kind of state oil company, which is increasingly privatized. But there's also an ExxonMobil plant. There's like a Chevron plant. There's a number of multinationals that have situated themselves in Jumbo. They kind of grew too large to be contained within Cali, so they moved kind of in these like suburban industrial cities, but I don't know, small cities that also lay like right in between the Pan American highway that crosses through Cali. And the Pan American highway is a very important highway that connects basically the entire continent of South America, or interconnects the different countries from the southernmost point all the way to basically the Panama Canal.
Right.
And also, derives a strategic corridor to Buenaventura, which is also the only way to export your products. So I think, the fight for Cali is really important. And if the Duque government at this point seems to be willing to do just about anything to take control over those points, those chokehold points, those really strategic points that protesters have been holding for the past 34, 35 days. And they're willing to use now just straight up military force.
Right.
And some of the points have been unblocked, but then the next day people come back. And so it's just been this kind of back and forth.
Right. And so one of the things that's interesting too is, people, the way the media has been trying to spin it, both in Colombia and here in the US and most of the West, is that both sides are instigating this violence, right? There's violence on both sides. The protesters are attacking the cops, and then the cops respond. But, you mentioned something interesting. You said that in Cali, there was an attempt to de-escalate the situation there by the resistance, by the protesters. And it wasn't until Duque ordered the military to go in there did we see that escalation in violence. So could you speak more to that, like how it's the police, it's the military when they're there that we see an escalation of violence?
Yeah. No, that's totally the case. I've been to a number of these protests, and we accompanied like 4 or 5 different points of resistance, and the feeling when you're there is one of total like community cohesion. There's children, there's workshops, there's music, there's dance, right? And it's not until the police come and instigate and usually start firing rubber bullets at people where it starts to deteriorate. But it's always the case that the police come in first with excessive use of force, and then escalate to tactics such as just straight up killing people, just straight up shooting people in the back, or detaining people arbitrarily or disappearing people. So that has been the case every single time. And like you said, like the people protesting have always had a position of negotiation. They want to negotiate, they want to be heard. They obviously don't trust the institutions. They don't trust the political parties. They have no reason to. They've never really been trustworthy at all. So they're trying to form their own representation. And I think this is something that's really interesting that's happening over the course of this protest, is this kind of awakening of this urban youth, this totally marginalized group of folks that have been totally left out of political power for centuries, and are rising up in a way that isn't just this kind of chaotic violence that is presented often in the mainstream media. I mean, there's a lot of organizing that's going on behind the scenes that's never shown because, if there's no like blood and, like Vice News won't come in and cover it. Right. But when there's not shooting happening, there's lots of organizing happening, a lot of popular education happening, a lot of organizing alternative media, organizing political platforms, but they just want to represent themselves. They don't want some politician to come through and co-opt the movement and be like, oh yeah, this is me, so that's what the worry is right now, is the co-optation. We're obviously in the beginning of a new electoral cycle for the presidency in 2022, I guess. Yeah, the summer of 2022 is going to be the presidential elections here in Colombia. And so it's starting to be sucked into all these calculations by the different like establishment and some, even some alternative political parties are trying to calculate where to position themselves vis-a-vis the strike. Meanwhile, the young people, or majority young people who are on the front lines are trying to organize kind of their own route within their own local communities. And it's been, I think, a really interesting thing to see when you finally see these communities that have been forced in a way to kind of give up their productive capacity to capital, right? Or their productive capacities have been totally monopolized by capital on their day-to-day life. And finally, they've been able to, during this time, kind of reorient their productive capacities towards the needs of their communities. And I think that's awakened a certain consciousness in them, that they've realized that they actually have a lot of power. Right. I mean, we look at the city of Cali, again, given the strategic importance of the city. This isn't a small city, this is a really major city in Colombia. And you see these people, with rocks and stones and shields, like makeshift shields out of scrap metal, being able to paralyze the city and therefore paralyze the national economy for over a month. This is, as it stands, the longest strike in Colombian history. And it's not the unions that are out here, although they're also an important part, but the level of union membership here is so slim, precisely because of the dirty wars that the U.S. has financed. The rate of unionization is less than 5%. And so most young people aren't part of a union and probably have never actually had a job. They also haven't been able to go to college because it's unaffordable. So these are the people who are currently at the front lines and really kind of becoming conscious of their historical agency in all of this. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic, along with the very intricate tactics that they've developed in order to hold these points for so long, despite the absolute, almost the entirety of Colombia's repressive apparatus going against them, is because they've organized these different lines. You have la primera línea, or the first line, and you can go all the way back, in the layers, all the way to like the sixth line. So you have lines that are only cyber lines that are meant to kind of magnify what's happening on the ground. You have groups of progressive lawyers that are the legal line. You have groups of medical students that are providing the volunteer medical brigades, to attend to the injured. You have like the mothers of the neighborhood doing the food brigades. So you have this whole spontaneous organizing happening, all for the purposes of maintaining this resistance in a permanent way, in a way that I haven't seen quite like this since I've been in Colombia. And a lot of people that I've spoken to who are Colombian and are like 60 years old say like this is totally new, and that these young people, this generation of folks, really have done something that has never been done before, in the way that they've also awakened this international solidarity that obviously Anticonquista is a part of, but we've seen protests in solidarity with Colombia all over. And we've even seen, this coalition between the Palestinian resistance and Colombian resistance. And I think that's very pleasantly surprising to me. But it totally makes sense. I mean, this is the exact same tactics that are used against the Palestinian people, that are used against Afro-Colombian indigenous campesinos across Colombia.
Yeah. And I'm actually really, that was a lot of information. That was really good, like well put, I had to say. And I'm glad you mentioned just like how organized it actually is. Because, again, I'm looking at some of the Western media here, and even Western media that's covering the protests in like a positive light, that's talking about it. Like you mentioned, Vice News. I'll go back to that one. Even when Vice News does a piece that's talking about, how strong the protesters are and how the youth are really rising up, they don't mention like behind the scenes, like you talked about, like the organization that goes behind all of this. You have like, like you said, you put it better than I ever could. The different like lines, the different brigades, everyone has a role to play, right? Whether it be in media, which is essentially propaganda, whether it be in medical brigades, distribution of food, frontliners. It's what people will highlight here, and what they'll talk about here is they'll talk about it like it's some sort of anarchist movement, like it's people are just going out there fighting against the cops and it's spontaneous, but it's not. There's an organization behind it, and it's not just the national strike organization. It's the youth. It's really I'm looking at Colombia as what's been the product of the pandemic, right? What the pandemic has done to not just Colombia, but every nation in the world, created a whole class of unemployed young people who, really don't have anywhere to go. They don't have many opportunities. And for now, because of this, you see a rising political consciousness, right? And that political consciousness is translating into action. Organized action, not like, it is spontaneous, but it's not spontaneous, disorganized anarchy. It's very well planned, very well thought out. And I think that's just so, yeah, I mean, the way you put it is just so well put. I think it's important because not many people are talking about that. No one, I actually haven't seen anyone talk about it like that. So I guess the next thing I kind of want to talk about or ask you about is what do you see, specifically in terms of other parts of Colombia? How are they relating back to the situation in Cali? Because Cali obviously is the epicenter, but there are things happening all throughout the nation, right? And you mentioned the region, Valle de Cauca, which is where, for those who don't know, that's where Cali is located. Other towns that are right next to Cali, like Yumbo, like you mentioned, Buenaventura, which is right down the highway road. But outside of those regions, there are also mass protests. There's protests in Bogota, in Medellin. We see an uprising everywhere. So how is this all like relating back to each other or linking back to each other?
Yeah, I mean that's totally the case. Cali has gotten a lot of media attention, but certainly in Bogota, there's protests all the time, and there's different points of resistance, along with Medellin, and along with other industrial centers, or perhaps not. Maybe industrial is not the term, but certainly home of really strategic industries. For example, Facatativá, which is kind of a suburb of Bogota, has also seen a lot of repression in the last few days because they're blockading the roads. In Facatativá is like the capital of flower production in Colombia, and flowers is one of the main exports that Colombia has. In fact, in the U.S., I think over 70% of flowers that you find are actually from Colombia. So if you go to Walmart and you look at a bouquet of flowers, it's made in Colombia, most certainly. And so it's one of the main industries of Colombia, and obviously the main source of one of the main sources of revenue for its capitalist class. And so to disrupt the export of flowers is strategic in the sense of inflicting pain on the ruling class that controls those industries, as well as Catatumbo, in Santander, another region in the eastern part of the country that is oil rich. That's where most of the oil gets extracted and then sent to other refineries throughout the country. But also in Catatumbo, the resistance has been really strong, along with La Guajira, which is there's like not as much tension, but the entire like mining union of Cerrejón being the largest open pit coal mine in the world. All of their workers have gone on strike in solidarity. So there's no coal coming out from the biggest mine in the world, or one of the biggest mines in the planet, and certainly the biggest mine in Colombia. A lot of that coal goes to Europe and goes to Israel. So these are really strategic chokeholds that are really well thought out. I mean, this isn't as random as you would think. Like I said, there's a lot of coordination going on. Credit to all the organizations that have been behind this. Obviously, they don't have control either. Like that, there's also this kind of narrative from the government that this is somehow controlled from Venezuela, or this is controlled from Cuba, or that all of these groups have like 100% responsibility for whatever happens. Like they can control what young people do. Like, no, it's a combination of both. Like you said, it's a combination of spontaneity. It's a right moment. It's just because the COVID crisis has instigated an existing crisis that was already baked in to the ledger, but has exacerbated to the point where people really have no choice but to resist at this point. But there's a structure in place. Like when young people say, I want to do something, like there's a place for them to go. They say, like, what can you do? Like, are you an artist? Or maybe you can do a workshop around art. Maybe you can do a mural. That's just as important as those who are bringing food, those who are bringing medical supplies, those who are, wielding the shields, protecting people from the ESMAD or the riot police that are shooting tear gas canisters or shooting rubber bullets or sometimes live rounds. And that's what we see also kind of in the broader scale of how different organizations and movements are working together to try and paralyze as much as possible the production of goods, goods that are not, by the way, intended for Colombians to consume. Right. So this is like the coal is not going to some, power plant that gives light to indigenous people in La Guajira. This is all going towards export markets. And so that's why, it's so strategic, because it really doesn't hurt the Colombian people. It only hurts the pockets of the transnational capitalist class.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's important because it's people trying to take back control of their communities, which have been sold out to these international, transnational corporations who are now consuming the goods that are being produced by their labor. And I mean, again, that was just well put in terms of how it's all connected. And the other thing, I think that we should talk about too is the racialized aspect of all this, right? How does race, and even how does gender? You kind of touched on this. You have sexual violence being weaponized against the protesters, right? And what does that do? That threatens, that intimidates folks, right? It strikes fear into folks, and not just it strikes fear mostly into women, obviously, and non-women, and you know, of those of the LGBT community. It strikes fear into them, but then it also strikes fear into really all of the society. Well, what about my family, right? They're threatening my family. They're threatening, you know, my mother, my wife, my cousin, my sister, whatever it might be. So, you know, how does, I guess, how does this all get racialized? How does race and then gender also play into this repression?
Oh, I think that's a really good point. Well, first of all, like both the police and the military are extremely racist and patriarchal institutions. You know, it's baked into their DNA. This kind of they internalize this violence, even amongst themselves. Then obviously, once you give them a gun, you know, it gets kind of projected outwards. And what we're seeing is like a microcosm of what has been such a defining characteristic of the Colombian conflict as a whole, meaning the most affected by the Colombian Civil War, which has been basically a proxy conflict funded by the United States, is indigenous, Afro-Colombian, and women, and the trans community and LGBTQI community that have been overwhelmingly affected, despite not, you know, disproportionately affected. And the same is true during this current wave of violence. If you see the victims of police brutality, of police assassinations, most of them are Afro-Colombian or indigenous, disproportionately so. And in the case of violence against women, I mean, it's also been systematic. I mean, just in our mission observing this past week, we had over 30 cases of rape by the Colombian security forces. I mean, a systematic use of sexual violence in a way to intimidate, as you said, to terrorize, you know, to inflict as much pain onto the communities as possible. And they do it in such a random way that it could be anyone, right? And so it does create this sensation of paranoia and of hypervigilance of, well, you know, they're just targeting everyone, even if you're not even at the protest, you know, or you just went, you know, you took your sign, you're walking home, and suddenly the police, you know, are detaining you, and the next thing you know, you're in some prison cell being, you know, being violated by a group of men. There was a famous case in Popayan of a girl who was sexually assaulted by members of the ESMAD and later committed suicide. So it's all for the purposes of inducing as much psychological terror and mass paranoia as possible. And in some ways it's working. And I mean, what it's trying to attack, as you said, is precisely these connections, right? These relationships of solidarity, of mutual aid that have emerged somewhat spontaneously, but have also been true during the entirety of the Colombian conflict. I mean, this is what has allowed these communities to survive for this long has been this reliance on each other to kind of get through. And that's what this is attacking. It's attacking those links of people and that kind of common sense of struggle and identity that allows sectors, very diverse sectors of society, to come together to try and, you know, pressure the government into negotiations, right? So you see, you know, Black women joining hands with students, you know, from the urban sector and rural, you know, people from rural communities joining hands with people from urban communities. So this kind of psychological terror is trying to erode the social fabric that allows people to come together. And it really does. And the fact that not only is this racialized violence and very much gendered violence in the way that they, you know, completely brutalize people's bodies and then exhibit them in such a crude way. And also the forced disappearances, you know, also are informed by this strategy of counterinsurgency warfare that has been the U.S. doctrine in Latin America for a long time, and has evolved to kind of encompass not just the quote-unquote insurgency or, you know, the communist or leftist movements, but also now it's incorporating entire swaths of the population. So now just being a young person in general makes you a target of a military operation that can, end in you being killed. And so I think that's I think it's important to highlight why this is happening, right? The violence that is used by the state also isn't random.
Right.
And it also isn't reactionary in the sense that it's presented in the media of like, oh, they're throwing rocks, so they start shooting them. No, all of this is calculated prior. This is part of a military doctrine that is decades old and has been used time and time again, and is slowly evolving to incorporate different techniques. Now they're using signal jammers in the different neighborhoods so that people can't do live stream. I mean, something that has characterized this protest is the use of Facebook Live to try and, jump over the media blockade. I mean, Colombia, the level of media concentration is extreme. I mean, there's basically 2 channels and they're owned by rich people, so there's no alternative media that people can look to other than Facebook Live. And so the neighborhood itself becomes the kind of the only ones capable of providing an accurate depiction of what is happening on the ground. And so they've managed to attack this in a kind of cybernetic way, using these signal jammers that are probably provided by the United States. But that once you're in this circle of jamming, like you can't do anything. Like you can't make a call. When we entered Siloé, suddenly your signal just is gone. Like you can't make calls, you can't go on Facebook, you can't use WhatsApp, you can't. And we've even seen cases of people being hacked, and people, I imagine the police going into their phone and deleting files. So even if you record something offline and then try to upload it, they might get into your phone and delete it before you can upload it. So we've seen this repression moving on to the digital and the virtual world.
Yeah, I mean the social media aspect of it, and just not even just the social media, but the media aspect in general is big. I mean, we've seen in the Palestinian resistance that just happened, and it's still happening now. Social media has played a huge role in creating international awareness, which led to international solidarity action. And the same has been true for Colombia. A lot of how we know what's going on is through social media. And not only that, but like you said, it's exposed the reality which is not being told by Western or Colombian media. So this is becoming more and more important. It's becoming something that national governments, dictatorships, terrorist states, whatever you want to call them, this is something that's becoming a staple in their strategy to repress, is to shut down the media. Is to shut down people's access to the media. And we've seen these rolling blackouts all throughout Colombia, and the constant blocking of the internet usage and such. But one of the things I wanted to get back to was what you talk about, how when it comes to the racial and gendered violence, part of it is, first of all, it's terror, right? The state is the one that is terrorizing the people. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. And second of all, what they're trying to do is de-link the community from itself, right? So divide the community. It's like that divide and conquer tactic. Make people afraid of their neighbors, of the people who are next to them. One of the things that came out, I saw a couple of days ago on video, was people were saying that the national police are now dressing up as civilians and going around and kidnapping people, beating people, arresting people. But why do they dress up as civilians? It's to make people more afraid. It's to create that paranoia that, the person next to me could be a police officer and I could be, taken away by them. I just want to ask you, is this actually true? Is this something that's actually happening on the ground there, that you've heard of or know of?
Oh, definitely. I forgot to mention that, but yeah, that's definitely kind of part of this counterinsurgency strategy, of really confusing who the perpetrators are, right? So precisely what you said, now they're dressing up as civilians, and sometimes it's just straight up civilians, like La Gente de Bien de Ciudad Jardín, this like upper class neighborhood in Cali that just came out guns blazing right in front of the police and started shooting protesters. But because the impunity is just like off the walls, and despite them being recorded on video, none of them are going to be prosecuted. It's this extension. You basically militarize the civilian population. No, you give them permission to do a purge-like, kind of rampage and start shooting people. And these are people who are deeply Uribista, deeply conservative, deeply Christian, but in a very fascist sense,
Right.
who see these protesters as, communists that deserve to be killed, like very much in line with the Cold War narrative. And now they're giving just like a totally open slate to do whatever they want. And Duque, right after the shooting in Ciudad Jardín, which we're actually there. I mean, I was there on that march in Univalle. I mean, I was blocks away from where that shooting took place, where I think at least 2 people were killed. Duque comes the next day and starts shaking hands with everyone, including the people who are involved with the shooting, basically signaling, yes, we are state sanctioning this. You can do this, and you're doing a good job. So go ahead, like pick up a gun and do more of it. And then you have, of course, civilian clothing. You have paramilitary activity. I mean, it's important to note that Cali is still very much like a narco trafficking hub. The Cartel de Cali of the 1990s and 80s. I mean, it's still around. Like these people live in Cali. They still do narco trafficking. And historically, like these kinds of mafias have always been used to break strikes, often in a very violent way. And that's the role they're playing now, is they're being almost subcontracted by the state, to rough these people up and impose terror by, just showing up to protest, lifting, levantando la gente, lifting people up in these unmarked white vans. We had 2 white vans show up during the Minga, an indigenous mobilization, and shoot 14 people. So this is like an everyday thing. We see reports of just wealthy Caleños, wealthy Colombians in the city of Cali coming together and pooling, doing like crowdfunding to fund acts of terror against the protesters. So now you have this like, I don't know, it's like ultimate neoliberal form of repression in which it's like now you're crowdfunding for state violence to be imposed on protesters. So it's in some ways it kind of reflects the neoliberal model of really disarticulating the production of violence. So now it's not vertically integrated as maybe corporations used to be. If we think of the state as a corporation of violence, it is now kind of licensing the ability to take this out as long as it's for the same goals. Well, certain people can do violence as long as it's against the people we want. It's kind of the logic of the state. And it does create this sense of paranoia. And I will add, it's not just people with guns who are dressing up as civilians. We have people who are infiltrating this with human rights vests, with international observers vests. So when I entered Siloé, immediately people asked for my ID. People were really worried that I might be an infiltrator because there's been cases of people with human rights vests that act or claim to be human rights lawyers, who are really police, or people don't know who they are, and they're taking pictures and they're taking records and they're taking people's names, which only helps to actually kind of obfuscate the true scale of the violence. When I went to Siloé, I would say like 80 to 90% of people did not want to talk about what happened. So whatever reports are coming out, they're vastly undercounts. Because the vast majority of people just stay home. They don't talk about it. There's no guarantees to talk. You don't know if this person's a real human rights lawyer or a human rights group, or if it's just some dude that's going to go report back to his police or going to report to one of these narco gangs. So it really is kind of very nefarious because it's just so hard to discern who's who. And I mean, I've met people who had been shot the night before, and they're just like nursing their wounds at home. They don't even want to go to the hospital because in the hospital, they're afraid that police will be waiting for them.
Yeah.
And in fact, the police has been calling hospitals on nights where there's shootings and protests and asking for, who's come in for gunshot wounds, asking for the rolls, asking for their IDs, asking for their address. For what? To go later that night, probably dressed in civilian clothes and finish the job.
Yeah. I mean, that's, it's horrible to think about because that's exactly what the strategy is, to destroy the the positive, like the good things that are coming out of this resistance, which is community power, mutual aid, the community coming together. I mean, it's so nefarious and evil to think that these are the tactics that are actually being implemented against the people who just want to live like good lives and want to protect their families and want a future for themselves. Right? I mean, the folks are fighting for their own futures. And two, I would be curious to know, like, those civilians who are taking it upon themselves, those Uribistas, predominantly, who are taking it upon themselves to attack the protesters. They're wealthy. I'm assuming most of them are probably from wealthy areas, right? They're probably the whiter Colombians who look upon the indigenous and Afro Colombians, who see them as lesser peoples, who dehumanize them, who denigrate them, right? And they feel empowered and entitled to act as an appendage, act as a link to the state, right? As an appendage to the state, to do what they think the state is, to do what they support the state in doing. I mean, would I be correct in saying that a lot of these folks are mostly like white Colombians who feel privileged in their in their whiteness or whatever it might be, to actually dehumanize and attack black and indigenous Colombians?
Oh, for sure. I mean, Ciudad Jardín is where a lot of these attacks are taking place, and it's not coincidental that Ciudad Jardín is probably the wealthiest neighborhood in Cali. Yeah. And there's this intersection between narco culture and Uribismo, So there's la narcocultura, and then there's the Uribista culture that has kind of merged seamlessly over time. I think the demographic that is composed, or that this kind of political movement is composed of a lot of the same people you'd see in the Black Lives Matter protests who'd show up with guns. The Kyle Rittenhouses in the United States case that also had, were basically sanctioned by police. Yeah, you can carry this out. I mean, he wasn't even detained. I mean, so what's happening in Colombia, we see glimpses of that in the United States, and it's what happens when you hyper-militarize a society. You see the rise of this vigilantism, where justice is violence, and violence is sanctioned one way or another by the state, especially by certain people against other people, right? So the state basically weaponizes one segment of society against the other, to try and do its bidding for it. It's something we've seen all along, but in Colombia, it's very, very stark. I mean, it makes the Kyle Rittenhouse shooting look pretty minor when you think about just how, I mean, this is daily, like every day we're seeing this, and it's being recorded and it's well documented. But it's that combination, I think, of narco culture, which is very patriarchal in nature, very machista in its origins, and then fused with this like Christian fascist right-wing ideology, I would say white supremacist ideology of this kind of settler colonial mentality of cleansing the society of its unproductive elements or undesirable elements. And that's something that happens a lot in Colombia, even before the paro, was limpiezas sociales, these social cleansing campaigns by right-wing paramilitary groups that would kill, homeless people and drug addicts and people with mental health problems. The people, it's a neo-fascist movement to try and purify the society. And that work will set you free, So they are proud to be productive members of society, the business owners, the capital class, the capitalist class, or at least try and imitate it using its, a very crude version of this.
Yeah, and what's funny too is you mentioned that they're proud to be productive members. Most of these people aren't productive. The people who are doing the work are the ones they're attacking, right? Like they're the ones who are doing most of the labor of the country. But it's this mindset, like you said, it's a neo-fascist mindset that is hyper capitalist, hyper individualist, hyper not even it's just straight up white supremacist. And I'm glad you made the link to Kyle Rittenhouse and like the vigilantism that we've seen here in the U.S. I think back to George Zimmerman. One of the first things I remember that really got me involved in when I was younger in the Black Lives Matter movement. because that was really the first case of just a community member taking it upon themselves to act as an appendage of the state, right? To go out and target someone who he thought was dangerous to the community. Something that I've experienced personally. People from the community feeling the need to take it upon themselves to act like police, right, or to act as appendages of the state. But in Colombia, we're seeing, Kyle Rittenhouse, George Zimmerman. These are just individuals, individual examples, right? In Colombia, we're talking about entire communities coming together, like you said, crowdfunding fascism, which is insane to think about nowadays. And I think the next thing I want to kind of touch on is the political situation. So how is the government of Colombia responding? One of the things I talked about last week was you had the Minister of Defense. There was a motion to censure the Minister of Defense, to say that, he's guilty of the crimes, the crimes that the police are committing, the police violence, the police brutality. And that censure was actually opposed in the Congress and the Senate. Most, no one, a lot of the opposition came together and defended him, saying, no, he's not doing anything wrong. So what is the government doing in all this? They're seeing their own people get murdered in the streets, getting kidnapped, getting arrested, tortured, beaten. Where are the politicians, supposedly the ones who are supposed to be representing the people?
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, the people aligned with the government. So there's been this combination of very opportunistic politicians on the right who have formed a coalition with the ruling party, which is the Centro Democrático, kind of at the same time that they're distancing themselves rhetorically from Duque, because he's extremely unpopular at this point. I think his approval rating is like less than 13%, whereas the strike has like over 70% approval. So the strike itself is vastly more popular than Duque, and I think he's kind of expendable. Like no one really cares about him. So even the United States isn't coming out rushing to defend him, because I think they understand his time, his days are numbered. I mean, he's not going to run again. Yeah. He's not going to win. So you see this like public-facing politician rhetoric of, "Oh, this is so bad," but like you said, once it comes to voting and trying to hold accountable those who are actually responsible, including Diego Molano, the defense minister, they don't. Right? They vote in favor of the state, and it's because the war here, in a lot of ways, is like very much established, kind of like it is in the United States. The ruling elites have a very militaristic mindset and try to solve basically all social problems through the military. That's why it's the best funded government entity by far. Is they just, whenever there's a problem, they just send the police. And Colombia is a very particular country because the police actually respond to the defense minister. So it's not separated as it is in the United States. Like, it's the defense minister, which in the US would be the Secretary of Defense, respond directly to him and to the commander-in-chief, which is Ivan Duque. So even police at the municipal level, like, actually have to follow orders from the president directly, which makes it even, which makes his responsibility in all of this even greater, because anything that the police does really the orders have to come from the president himself.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would say there's been a very hypocritical, but I'm not surprised. Although there's some opposition politicians, Feliciano Valencia, Gustavo Petro, Roy Barrera, there's been a number of them that have actually spoken out and been really, really outspoken, and have even traveled to the United States to lobby in favor of the protesters and against the government. So it's a mixed bag, but the ruling party and its coalition is certainly not really representing anyone other than, the oligarchs that run the country.
Yeah. And it's interesting, the opposition or the government in charge right now is, like you said, extremely unpopular, not representing the people. But what is coming out of the U.S. in terms of propaganda, especially when thinking about Colombia's next door neighbor, Venezuela, it's, oh, well, the Venezuelan government is not representative of the people, or it's oppressive, and it's a dictatorship, it's this or it's that. They labeled Maduro, I think just last year under Trump, labeled him a narco dictator, saying he has ties to the cartel. Meanwhile, you have all of this going on in Colombia, which is like right a slap in your face. Like, bro, this is going on right in a country you call an ally. Everything you're saying is going on in Venezuela is happening in one of your allied states, but you're not doing anything about it. There's been if we're being honest, there's been a half-assed effort on the U.S. on Biden's part to actually confront the issues that are going on in Colombia. I mean, the best that we've gotten so far is a strongly worded letter by a couple politicians in the U.S. and it's a little, anything is better than nothing, but the best we've gotten so far is a strongly worded letter to Biden saying, we have to at least acknowledge that there's abuses being committed. We need more than that. We need to cut off the funding to Colombia. We need to stop arming them. We need to do something about the government in charge. Stop supporting the government in charge, whether it be implicitly or explicitly or implicitly, in order to actually make a difference. We're getting to like the hour mark, and I don't want to take up too much of your time. But I think it's important to talk about just the differences between Colombia and Venezuela in terms of that propaganda, because we see two very different reactions from the United States to both nations. One, and it's funny because both nations are doing two very different things. Colombia is repressing its people. Venezuela is trying to build up its population, right? Two totally different strategies, two totally different end goals, and yet the response by the U.S. is completely backwards, right? It doesn't make it to any normal person. It doesn't make any sense.
Totally. No, yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. Like, I think the contrast between Colombia and Venezuela is the only case you need to know to understand the way the U.S. propaganda machine works and the hypocrisy that's baked into U.S. foreign policy. I mean, they don't care about human rights. They don't care about democracy. They have their own strategic interests in mind, and as long as those are being fulfilled, then they're not going to make too much noise. Colombia provides such a strategic advantage for the United States, the same way Israel does in the Middle East, in order to project power into the region. I mean, a lot of the sabotage operations, in fact, basically all of them that have gone to Venezuela have stemmed from Colombia. We've even seen an escalation of a kind of proxy conflict starting to broil on the Venezuelan-Colombian border with these so-called FARC dissidents that, in my mind, are really probably being organized much as the Contras were in Nicaragua in the 1980s. I mean, there's much more investigation to be done, but that's my worry, is that they'll try to do some kind of proxy conflict as they did then, to try and just terrorize the population as much as possible and force the Venezuelan government to pay attention to the border, which might force them to ignore other parts, of their country. But like, even in the side of like competence, which Maduro's always like, oh, he's an incompetent leader. I mean, but he handled the COVID crisis way better, even with the U.S. sanctions that have stripped the country from 99% of its revenue, according to the UN. There's far less people dead in Venezuela of COVID. Colombia is one of the worst countries in terms of its COVID response. And it's precisely because of the neoliberal assault on its people and on public institutions that people are rising up against right now. It's not a coincidence. People are tired of seeing their family members die in a waiting room because there's no infrastructure, or they don't have insurance. The numbers that we're seeing in terms of COVID deaths are largely deflated as well. And yeah, the U.S. response has been typical. Maybe some, hey, don't use excessive use of force, obey, international norms.
Yeah.
But it's not even a bipartisan thing. Like, the letter that was signed from the House of Representatives, there's like 50 people on it. When there was a bill to sanction Venezuela and freeze all weapon sales to Venezuela, I mean, that was bipartisan. That passed like in a day. There wasn't even a debate. Or the same with Nicaragua and other these countries that are part of the quote unquote troika of tyranny. So it just goes to show it's not hard to get bipartisanship if it's for the interest of U.S. and the U.S. empire. But when it's in the name of solidarity and really protecting civilians, it's super hard. It's like pulling teeth. I mean, people are afraid of the Colombian backlash electorally. There's a large right-wing Colombian population in Florida. The same with the Venezuelan, expat community, and so it makes it really difficult to pass these through. But I have been, pleasantly surprised by the response of other Colombian Americans or Colombians living in the United States who have, been protesting and showing their solidarity in the streets. And I think that's super cool. Moving from just a representation of solidarity, on their like Facebook page or changing their profile to really active solidarity in action. At the end of the day, solidarity is action. It must take place in the streets. It must take place collectively. Otherwise, it's just a charade.
Right. Yeah. And I guess the last two things I want to touch on is, looking to the future. So two things that I think we need to keep in mind. One, what are the demands coming out on the ground that, from Colombia, what are the demands that these organizations are making that we need to pay attention to, that we need to continue to support? And two, what can we do for those who are outside of Colombia, who are in the diaspora, whether it be in the U.S., whether it be in Europe, in Canada, wherever it might be? What can we do as a diaspora movement to continue to aid in fulfilling the demands of those who are on the ground, who are continuing to resist?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of different factions that are calling for different things depending on the locality. But it's definitely transitioned from, kind of getting rid of the tax reform, the healthcare reform, the various reforms that Duque was trying to push through initially, and now it's turned into, kind of broader demands of universal education, high quality education, universal healthcare. They're even talking about universal basic income for low income families in Colombia. And very importantly, the implementation of the 2016 peace agreement that has kind of lost a lot of its, a lot of attention in recent years, but it's still there. And it's still very important, particularly for rural communities, for that to be implemented. Because within it, there's a number of structural reforms that would make a huge difference in Colombian society. Amongst them, point one, which is a comprehensive rural reform, land redistribution, giving back the land that was stolen from indigenous, campesino, and Afro-Colombian communities, giving it back to them, and providing infrastructure investments, different kind of programs that would allow them to remain in their communities for long periods of time and not be forced to move, to the cities to look for economic opportunities and such. So I think for people in other countries, particularly in the United States, the U.S. plays a huge role in terms of the implementation of this plan. The U.S. war on drugs is, completely in opposition, diametrically opposed to the implementation of some of the core aspects of this agreement. And so before this whole paro initiated, Duque announced a return to something called aerial glyphosate fumigations. For those who don't know what that is, it's basically chemical warfare against rural communities in the name of fighting coca, of exterminating coca plants that is used. It's one of many different ingredients that is used in the production of cocaine, but it's also used traditionally by indigenous communities for thousands of years before, but has been, criminalized and stigmatized by the U.S. and its allies for the past few decades. And so that is still a threat for these communities beyond the paro. And so keeping in mind kind of a long-term view of what is required for some of these structural issues to be alleviated and for the Colombian people to have a chance at a dignified life, the peace accord implementation is crucial. And obviously continuing to support and continuing to highlight the abuses of the Colombian government, providing these kind of material and mutual aid programs, giving people on the front lines supplies. I think that's a super interesting way for the diaspora to get connected from their own positions of relative wealth, comparatively speaking, that they can afford to send $50 or whatever to Colombians on the ground. I think that's a super kind of innovative way of engaging the Colombian diaspora, as well as other members of the community that have been forced to flee precisely because of this kinds of violence. So I think just continuing to engage and continuing to learn from the compañeros on the ground in Colombia, in the creative ways that they've learned to adapt and resist in very ingenious ways. I think there's lots to learn from them. And so just keeping an eye open beyond this crisis, because I'm sure this will end at some point, at least in this stage of it. So just maintaining like that relationship long term is what a lot of organizations are calling for. Like they don't want charity. They don't want you to feel bad for them. And they're tired of Colombia being seen as this basket case, this just inherently violent place that's, always a shit show. There's always some Pablo Escobar, whatever. Like the conception of Colombia is just like this really bloody place that has no hope. And in fact, it's the opposite when you really get down to it and you talk to people on the ground. I mean, they have plenty to teach, and we really have to reverse the kind of north-south relationship that has characterized movements in the past, and really try and reverse it into a south-north relationship in which they start to teach us, who are in the United States and who are in the global north, ways to resist. I think they're showing the world what they could do, and really that should give us a lot of hope. And when we're talking about these points of resistance in Cali, I mean, we're not talking about millions of people here, or like they're billionaire funded or something like that. I mean, these people are scraping by, and they've managed to sustain the longest strike in Colombian history. I mean, these are groups of 40, 50 young people in each point, articulated in such a way that has allowed them to resist for such a long time. And that should give us hope. I think in the US, and then the popular assemblies, this participatory democracy that is flourishing in spite of these terror tactics by the government, to me, gives me a lot of hope. And I think for folks abroad, just kind of changing the chip of thinking that, the solutions or the most innovative things are coming or can only come from the United States or Europe. And really being just humbling up, really just keeping an eye open and a really open mind to learn, and ideally come down, come down yourself and really share with these people, because I think there's something special about physically being in the surrounding. I mean, it's surreal. It really, really is inspiring to be in these community, held places, where they retake spaces that have been taken from them, and really, and just kind of showcase their ability to cooperate, to collaborate in very creative ways. And so, I think those would be the things. Just don't forget the peace agreement. Especially if you're in the United States, which is a guarantor, it's a guarantor nation in this agreement. So that means it plays a very special role of the implementation of this agreement. Getting your representative to say something, to speak out, I think would be good. But obviously, I think this kind of grassroots, people to people stuff, it really is where it's at. I don't have that much faith in the political system. I have much more faith in people getting organized in communities that are also facing these kinds of oppressions in the United States, to reach out, and to not be such a stranger, and to find ways to overcome some of the barriers, some of the language barriers that exist. But there's ways to do that, and we're here to help. And that's what I love to see, is folks in the U.S. who often feel alone. There's this really U.S.-centric mindset that sometimes gets ingrained into movements in the U.S. in a way that disarticulates what makes us kind of have common ground. And there's groups like, I'll say Congreso de los Pueblos. I'll mention some of the groups that people should follow and support. Congreso de los Pueblos is one of them. It's one of our partners, and they're basically a big umbrella organization. I mean, it's called the People's Congress, and they've articulated different segments of society: Afro-Colombian, indigenous peoples, campesinos, urban youth, the unemployed, the elderly. Everyone has a seat at the table. It's a really beautiful thing to see. Tomorrow, they're having a popular assembly I'll be attending. I'll be reporting about what's going on there. But they're a really, I think, inspiring example of what is possible once we start to overcome these artificial boundaries that separate us, from, oh, this is the Black struggle. Oh, this is the immigrant struggle. Or like we see in the US, this is a combination of everything. I mean, and it's not led by some political party. This is grassroots as it gets. It's all funded by grassroots stuff. Ciudad de Movimiento is another group that focuses on, taking back the territory. And there's a really interesting concept in Colombia. I know I'm going really long now, but I guess you'll edit it later. But this concept of el territorio, the territory. And I think in English we don't really have a concept like that, but el territorio encompasses everything. It's not just land as a commodity. It's land and all of its cultural significance that is tied to it, all of its history, all of its environment, all of its resources, both human and natural resources that are combined. So it's this very comprehensive understanding of where we live, and what makes life worth living, and how we should defend that. And they're trying to bring that concept into the cities. These are peoples who have been I don't know, los han expulsado del territorio, no? They've expelled them from their territories, stripped them from their territorial identity. So this Ciudad de Movimiento is an attempt to reconstruct that in the city, in the urban environment, and really take back the city, really democratize the city. And I think it's a super important movement, because the reality is Colombia was forcibly urbanized by the last 60 years of war, where it's now 80% urban, 20% rural, totally flipped in the past 40 years. So now, as we're seeing today, the resistance movements are going to come from the slums. It's not going to be coming from the jungle. The days of those things, I think, are probably numbered. And the future of any revolution is going to be youth-led, women-led. It's going to be from the slums, and it's going to be horizontal, democratic, inclusive. And I think Congreso de los Pueblos, Ciudad de Movimiento, PCN, these are movements, El Proceso de Comunidades Negras, are groups that people should be looking at for inspiration, as well as for support.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna edit it later, but I'm not gonna change any of that, because that was, that was really well said. I think that's a great way to close it out. I mean, I really like what you said about, thinking about this as learning from the South and then bringing it to the North, right? A South-North relationship. It reminds me of what happened last summer with the BLM protests in 2020. What were a lot of the tactics being used there? There were tactics that were being learned from the Palestinian movement, Palestinians who are on social media telling people how to deal with tear gas, how to deal with police repression, how to deal with this or that. I mean, that is kind of one of the things we emphasize on Anticonquista, that, being here in the diaspora, we got to understand that our people back in Latin America or in Africa or in Asia or whatever they may be in the global South, they have a lot to teach us, because they're the ones who are oftentimes on the front lines of these movements, dealing with some of the most violent repression and the most violent attacks, whether it be by the police or by the military. And so I think you put it beautifully. I couldn't say it better myself. It's learning from everyone who's out there, and not just focusing on our own struggles. And it's not only that, but again, like you said, it's connecting the struggles. The immigrant struggle is connected to the Black struggle. There are Black immigrants out there, right? And they face not only here in the United States, for example, they face not only the problems and the oppression from ICE, but also because of their skin color, right? Because of what they look like. And all of these struggles are interconnected, and it's not until we make those connections that we're actually going to see some progress on those fronts, like some real progress, and not some performative like actions that, like painting a street or changing the name of a street. Something material is what we're looking for. So again, thank you so much, Evan, for that. I mean, if you have any last concluding remarks, like, please go ahead. But I think what you said, what the information that you provided here today was great. I think I learned a lot, and I'm gonna keep trying to give these updates and keep trying to keep people informed, because that's what's necessary.
No, thanks. No, thanks for inviting me. I think it's a great conversation. I hope people can learn from this. Yeah, I'm just trying to. I'm glad that you found it helpful, and yeah, that's the goal of all of this, is to interconnect struggles, really, like to not see this as something foreign. This is a Colombian problem. Like, all of these problems are transnational. I mean, we live in a globalized world, truly, and we really have to, like, in order to be successful, we have to start to recognize that. And the people who are oppressing us, they recognize that a while ago. Like, they be sending delegations to Colombia. Every year they're doing joint military operations between the US and Colombia. Colombia's going to Honduras, going to Mexico, right? So they have this figured out. I mean, they be, sharing tactics all the time, sharing equipment all the time. They're probably friends on Facebook, so why don't we do that? Why aren't people who are resisting these things doing delegations to train others on how to do the tour guide, or just on the experience? Like, I think, like, if the BLM had known how to do what Cali's doing, like if they had taken Washington D.C. for 30 days, like, think about what world we'd be living in right now.
Yeah.
Like, they would have been, it just would have been something so different. And like, something that Colombia teaches us to imagine, like, just like really rewire and really push our imagination. I'd say something that characterizes a lot of people in the United States is just their lack of imagination. I mean, they've really stripped that from us. And it's not until you go somewhere else and you see, oh, these are really ordinary people. Like, there's nothing genetically different from Colombians. Like, we could do this. We could do what they're doing. We could even do something different. But there's no reason why we couldn't resist in the same way that they are, and we couldn't join together. And in fact, the more we do, the more successful they'll be. Like, if port workers in the United States refuse to handle Colombian goods, like, oof, it's going to amplify the strike here. Like, if and really, that's the only way for these strikes to really be successful in its entirety is for it to be targeted at the entire transnational network. It can't be just one factory. Because there's 10 other factories, in Mexico and Honduras. So we have to articulate all the factories, transnationally, to do simultaneous actions. And so I think that's a real possibility. I mean, like, I think people are starting to realize that, and I think that's a good thing. And COVID, if anything, has taught us just how interconnected everyone is. And like, we can't afford to ignore what's happening elsewhere. We really have to be, vigilant, and we have to be really adaptive. We can't just be, settle in our own ways, or thinking that the U.S. is some exceptional nation. There's a lot of American exceptionalism that is embedded, I think, in this kind of thinking of there's nothing to learn elsewhere. Or, why are we going to go to Cuba, or why are we going to go to Colombia to learn about stuff? So I'd encourage folks to do just that. I mean, part of what we do with the Solidarity Collective is these delegations, popular education delegations that are meant to teach U.S.-based activists about the techniques, about the strategies that are being used on the daily in places like Colombia to resist, I think, in circumstances that are far more dire. Like, the fact that they work here means they can work anywhere. Things like La Guardia Indígena, things like La Guardia Campesina, La Guardia Cimarrona, which we didn't get touched on here, but maybe a subject of a different conversation. But I think that's a really, like, super interesting mechanisms of collective protection that, in the age of defund the police and Black Lives Matter, like, these are ideas that we should be putting on the table for folks. I mean, there's no reason why there shouldn't be a Black community guard in places like Minneapolis. Yeah. Why not? Like, I don't know. Anyways, I've gone too long, but I could talk about this for a long time.
No, yeah. I mean, yeah, no, those are all great points. Like it's about learning from each other because this is an international movement. So, I mean, I think it's a lot of information. It's a lot of good information that I hope people can learn from too, and not only learn from but stay connected to, right? So many times we see people have like short attention spans with this. It's like it happens for maybe a week or two, and then people lose interest. So part of what we're trying to do is keep that interest going for as long as possible because it's necessary. So thank you so much for joining us too. What I'm gonna do is for those watching, I'm gonna put probably like a list of the different organizations that Evan mentioned in the description, so we could all like check that out, keep in touch with them, know who they are, follow them because they're gonna keep giving updates. A lot of these organizations we follow on Anticonquista and we follow at Red Condor, so they're some of the sources that we use to talk about what's going on the ground in Colombia. So I'll share those with everyone else so everyone knows, and I'll share too the GoFundMe Red Condor has because they're still collecting money and they're still giving it to folks on the ground in Colombia. And yeah, again, thank you so much, Evan, and check out too for those who don't know Witness for Peace. I can attest personal experience that their delegations are really good, really informative. Like for me, it was life changing. It was information that I would never have known if I never went to specifically the delegation I went to was to Cuba. And so that was an experience which uh, really kind of changed my life and made me see things in ways I never thought I would. So thank you so much, Evan. Thank you so much to Witness for Peace too, for the work that they do and the delegations they do. And we're gonna keep giving the updates on Colombia. So thanks for that, and hope everyone has a good week and weekend.
Thanks.